Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott. Earlier this year, I reviewed the Yongnuo or YN 11mm f1.8 lens for Sony E-mount, and I found it to be both interesting and innovative. I'm back with another YN review, but this time it is on Fuji's X mount. This is the Yongnuo or YN 50mm f1.8X DA DSM Pro. And it's an interesting lens with a nice blend of performance, features, and a surprisingly upscale build, all for a reasonable price of less than $300. Now, there are some of those typical X-mount frustrations that I run into with basically every Fuji X-mount review that I do, and I will detail all of that as a part of this, but overall, this is a nicely upscale alternative to lenses like the Viltrox 56mm f1.7 or the TT Artisan 56mm f1.8, both lenses that I reviewed earlier this year, and of course, much cheaper alternatives to some of the first-party offerings from Fuji. Now, Yongnuo likes to make some rather wordy names here, and so I'm going to break down what that means. This is the F1.8X. The X stands for Fuji X mount. DA does not stand for Dustin Abbott, disappointingly, but it is their designation for APS-C. DSM refers to a digital stepping motor, and Pro is really key to this lens because, somewhat confusingly, they have another 50mm f1.8X DA DSM lens. It is actually a completely different lens than this Pro Series lens. The Pro Series lens is larger, heavier, it's a different optical formula, it is sharper, it has more features, on and on the list goes. It's a completely different lens, but it's only that Pro designation that sets them apart, and they're using Pro here to designate a higher end build, feature set, and performance in this case. And so just understand you need to differentiate between those two. This new lens is, it's about twice as expensive, twice as heavy, and twice as good. Now, this lens in size, it's a little bit bigger than, say, the Viltrox or TT Artisan 56mm lenses. It's 68mm in diameter, or 2.67 inches, 85mm in length, so a fairly long little lens. And so it's 3.34 inches, and the weight is 387 grams, or 13.65 ounces. So it's definitely it's still small and, overall it is lightweight, but there is definitely some heft to it. And part of it is because this has such a high build grade. I keep an open note going on my phone for just kind of field observations when I'm doing reviews. And one of the things that I noted in my notes is that this lens really reminded me a lot of a Zeiss Batis lens, in that it has a more upscale build, but it also has a top-mounted LCD screen, and that's part of what kind of led me to that. So in this case, it is definitely upscale materials here. The housing of the lens is actually made out of an aircraft aluminum alloy. It has that black satin anodized finish that looks really fantastic, modern and sleek. So it makes the lens look and feel really premium. And then it does have a small top-mounted LCD screen. That LCD screen has some limited functionality, and that is accessed largely because there is a custom switch on the side of the lens, and if you are in the mode 1 position, this will allow the ring to actually function as an aperture ring, and so this will allow you to see real-time aperture changes. And then also it'll allow you to also move into an auto position where you can, if you want to just control it from within the camera, you can then control it from within the camera. Now in mode number 2, it has the ring functioning as a manual focus ring. Though I will note, you still have to enter manual focus mode from the camera body. That's just the way that Fuji cameras are designed, and so that it's not really like an AF/MF switch. It just allows you to, you're just designating what the function of the ring is going to be. Now, one change that I would have liked to have seen implemented here is that, like on the Zeiss Batis lenses, the Batis lenses, you can see aperture, yes, but it will also function as a distance scale when you're actually using it for manual focus. I would have liked to seen that to give you some kind of on-screen distance scale, because it would be useful when manually focusing, but unfortunately that functionality is not here. Now, on the manual focus mode itself, the focus ring is nice, wide, but it's very lightly damped, so it doesn't have a ton of feel. And as is often the case here on Fuji, you have to make many rotations if you want to make a large focus change. And so it's not really useful for big focus pulls. It's basically only useful for making small adjustments if you want to do it with any kind of urgency. So I don't love that, but that's pretty common on Fuji, one of my Fuji frustrations. Up front, we have a 58mm front filter thread. A lens hood is included. It is just a basic plastic lens hood. It is quite deep, and it's definitely needed because this is a somewhat flare-prone lens. As a part of the upscale build here, we do have weather sealing. That's a gasket back at the lens mount. I'm not sure about internal seals. I haven't seen a diagram, but there is definitely a gasket there, a flooring type coating on the front element to help with fingerprints and moisture on the front. And then also there is a covered USB-C port down here on the lens barrel. Now to access that, you have to take off a little rubber gasket. And unfortunately, it's quite hard to get it out. You either need to have a long fingernail or some small bladed tool like a screwdriver to kind of pry that out, but you have to be careful because it's small and you could easily lose it. And if you lose that, of course, you are creating a place where water could get into your lens theoretically through that USB-C port. So just be careful with that. USB-C port is to allow you to do firmware updates, and it definitely was warranted here on my XH2 body. There was some compatibility issues initially, and that firmware update solved all of those, and so the lens is fully compatible and works flawlessly now. There are 9 rounded aperture blades inside. That again is one area of differentiating between the cheaper lens that has only 7 blades. This has a higher blade count and thus a little bit more circular aperture. Minimum focus distance is 45 centimeters, and you have about an average 0.15 times magnification. And up close performance is fairly decent. So overall, it is a really nice build. The lens feels really nice in hand. It feels very quality. So nice bang for the buck for a little under $300. Now on the autofocus side of things, as noted, we have a DSM or digital stepping motor. Now it is here where most of my Fuji frustrations come into play because the state of autofocus on Fuji is unfortunately years behind what basically all the other platforms that I test are. And so as a byproduct, it tends to drag down the performance of all the lenses that I test on there. So some of the good is that the DSM motor, it is very quiet in operation. You basically need to put your ear right up next to it to hear any kind of focus noise. Focus speed is generally fairly fast, though as you can see here, there is sometimes some obvious steps there. And again, that's a Fuji related thing. If I were to take the same lens and put it on a Sony camera, if I had a Sony mount, I can guarantee you would see none of that stepping performance. It's more of a Fuji thing, but it does slow down autofocus just a little bit. However, in real world use with ordinary subjects, autofocus was quick enough that I didn't really think about it at all. So no genuine complaints there. I also found that AF accuracy was good in most applications. I found, for example, taking people pictures, I got good detection on the eye. You can see in this shot of a Ferrari, for example, that focus is just nailed. And of course, the lens is also very sharp, but we'll get to in just a moment. But where things will fall apart is if there is any kind of persistent action, And so in this sequence here, where Nala's moving towards the camera, there's definitely some drops to back focus that take place. And so you can't really trust autofocus if in persistent movement. Now I was able to nail shots at a dog show of dogs jumping over a kind of a bar. But what I did was I pre-focused into that area and then only started to focus on the dog when they got close. And I was able to thus get, decently focused results in that situation. Now, when you switch over to the video side of things, that's where everything really falls apart on Fuji when it comes to autofocus. And it's a combination of a few things. Again, autofocus is just not as sophisticated, for one. But then also the touch screens are really disappointing, just not very responsive. And so if I'm trying to do focus changes via touch to focus, the autofocus, there's just such a huge lag and sometimes just a reluctance to change focus altogether. And so you can see on my focus pull test, I had to kind of set focus and then just sit there for several seconds until eventually the body decided to focus and then coming back, exercise and frustration. And in some real world shots where I was trying to create focus change in that way, I would tap and tap on the screen and just basically nothing would happen. So somewhere in between the lens and the camera itself, the issue lies. It's not unusual with third-party lenses, but unfortunately, it's not all that unusual with first-party lenses either. So it's just a bit of a frustration of mine in that regard. So that didn't go particularly well. Likewise with my hand tests, where I alternatively block and then remove the view of my face with my hand. There's such lag and a lack of responsiveness that you can see it misses the majority of the time. So not great in that regard. Now, where I found things a little bit better is if I was just trying to track some kind of smaller action. So for example, in this shot of cone flowers that are blowing around in the wind, autofocus seems to be doing a pretty good job of keeping up with those subtle movements. Likewise, in the shot of a slow moving sailboat coming into scene and across frame, no problems there. Autofocus was stable for that. And so it's a bit of a mixed bag. I did note some focus breathing and any kind of significant focus change. And so really this is a lens that probably works best with just trying to track ordinary focus. And don't try to use it for actions, for stills, and don't try to use it for big focus swings when it comes to video work either. Now on the image quality side of things, we swing to a much more positive performance. This, even though we're testing on the 40 megapixel Fuji sensor, which is easily the most demanding platform I have ever tested lenses are, it has made more lenses look bad in terms of their inability to resolve this very high pixel density than any other camera platform that I've used before. But this lens, fortunately, is very capable of keeping up. It is an optical design of 11 elements in 8 groups. 6 of those are exotic elements of 3 different varieties. You can see from the MTF chart that it shows a very good consistency across the frame. There's a bit of a divergence of the 2 tangents there, so it shows a little bit of loss of contrast in the corners, a little less acuity maybe there, but overall performance is really quite good. And I found in real-world results that the performance is strong even on this body, so that's a big plus there. Very good performance when it comes to vignette and distortion. On the distortion front, there's just a tiny bit of pincushion distortion that's not worth correcting. If you want to correct it all, I used a -2 for correction. There's a moderate amount of vignette, but on the low side of moderate. I used a +41 to correct, and that is about a 1.5 stops. So again, not bad at all on that. And so definitely better than some alternatives when it comes to those metrics. I found that there is some uncorrected longitudinal chromatic aberration, a little bit of fringing before and after, particularly after the plane of focus, though that is going to have a positive side effect that I'll detail in just a moment. The lateral style chromatic aberrations are basically non-existent, so no issue with that. So all of this leads to very good sharpness results. So I'm showing you results at 200% magnification, and again on this most demanding sensor, and the fact that it looks good is impressive. And so there's good sharpness across the frame, even at f1.8. Yes, the corners are a little softer, but comparatively, they're still relatively strong. I found that there's a little more contrast available if you stop down to f2, just that minor stop down. And then if you stop down to f2.8, it's a little bit more significant. By landscape apertures of f5.6, we're razor sharp all across the frame, even into the deep corners. And so that gives you a lot of flexibility when it comes to cropping, for example, on a high resolution body. I was able to change up framing without any kind of issue there. By the time you hit f11, again on a highly pixel dense sensor like this, you're definitely going to see the effects of diffraction. And by f16, which is minimum aperture, it is much more obvious there. Now I noted some trade-off for leaving a little bit of the fringing uncorrected, and that pays off in having softer, more beautiful bokeh. And there is definitely a correlation between those two things. So in this case, they haven't overcorrected to the degree that the lens has lost all of its character and become sterile, and that is advantageous here, and that the bokeh is really quite pleasing from this lens, and I would say that it's a cut above what I saw from either TT Artisan or Viltrox. So very nice bokeh, and thus overall very nice rendering of most images. Where this lens is not great is when it comes to flare resistance. It is very flare prone, and it's particularly susceptible to flare patterns if the bright light source is just right out of the frame in the upper corners. And so you can see that it can look really bad here. At the same time, I could mitigate a lot of that by just composing a little more carefully. So word to the wise is if you don't want flare artifacts, just kind of watch your viewfinder and get to an angle and a framing that works a little bit better, and you'll avoid some of the greatest frustrations there. Overall, however, for a lens of this type, that optical performance is very solid. So my conclusion is this. This is a beautifully made little lens that feels premium, and I would say it produces premium looking images. I feel like it still has some character to it, and often those lenses can produce the more artistic, generally beautiful looking images. Obviously, autofocus is the area of my greatest frustration. There's definitely some frustrations near the edges, but again, a lot of that is on the Fuji platform. So I would say that this lens is neither better nor worse than most third-party lenses on the Fuji X-mount platform. There's definitely room for improvement, but I suspect that a lot of the improvement needs to come from the Fuji side of things. But again, you need to just keep those limitations in mind depending on what your case use for the lens will be. So it's a pretty good bang for the buck lens. If you're looking for a nicer tier of lens than the Viltrox/TT Artisan level, or you're more interested in the 50mm, which is a 75mm full frame equivalent, rather than an 85mm full frame equivalent that you get from 56mm. And so just definitely something to bear in mind there. Now, if you want more information, you have some options. You can check out my full text review that's linked in the description down below. There's also an image gallery and buying links that are linked in the description. Or you can stay with me right now as we go into the deep dive into the optical performance. So we'll start by taking a look at vignette and distortion. As you can see here on the left in the uncorrected raw, not a whole lot going on here. Tiny bit of pincushion distortion, but a vignette mostly that is concentrated towards the corners. Here on the right, a manual correction. You can see even doing the manual correction, I can clear things up really nicely. Everything's pretty minuscule here, a -2 to correct for that bit of pincushion distortion. Vignette at +41. In most images, you could probably leave both of those things uncorrected and be perfectly happy. Now, as noted in our overview of the optics, you can see that there is some uncorrected longitudinal chromatic aberrations here, mostly fringing that comes after the plane of focus. You can also see that the contrast is still holding up well, and so this actually has relatively little impact in real-world shots. Also, lateral chromatic aberrations near the edge of the frame are well controlled here. There's no correction going on here, but you can see that transitions from black to white look quite good. So how about resolution and contrast? Here at f1.8, I'm going to show you results at 200% magnification. This is on the 40 megapixel sensor of the XH2. So you can see then in the center of the frame, good detail, good contrast. Contrast is not exactly top tier, but very, very good and able to show a lot of detail. A good, strong mid-frame performance there, and you can see lots of details holding up. One thing I like to look at is this bill. Typically, when lenses are going to fall apart, this side will look okay. This side's already starting to fade. You can see it's really consistently good, and there's a lot of detail showing there. And you can see why when we look down here. The resolution is holding up pretty nicely right into the corner of the frame. Now, if we stop down from f1.8 to f2, and we can see that there is a little bit of an uptick in contrast that was missing wide open. You can see it looks a little bit better, a little bit darker here. And so stop down to f2 if you want a little extra punch to your images. Here's a real-world shot at f2 of Ferrari, and you can see that the detail and contrast looks really fantastic. Lots of fine details that are all nicely delineated here in the fur. So this is a lens that's able to handle those kind of the micro contrast and fine details pretty well. In some ways, the rendering actually reminds me of Fuji's own 33mm f1.4. There's a bit more of a boost from, if you go down to f2.8, you can see contrast is picked up a little bit further. We'll look at a few other spots. You can see it's just more consistently nice contrast there. If we go over here to the left side, good detail holding up there into the corner. Likewise up here, and finally upper right corner, showing a pretty decent centering performance, maybe just a little softer here in the upper right corner, but overall a pretty strong performance. If we stop on down to f5.6 into kind of the landscape aperture territory, you can see that we've got intense contrast now, great detail. here in the mid frame, looking really, really fantastic, and right down into the corners. Corners are now looking pretty pin sharp, and so you can see how much different it looks even from f2.8 to f5.6. So this translates into really good detail in landscape type shots. And so this is obviously a big scene with a lot on the frame, but you can see everywhere we look. Again, the lens has good ability to delineate all those fine details. You can see this island out here in the bay. You can see that it just looks really fantastic out there. And if we look a little bit closer here on the golf course, you can see a golfer walking down there. Remember, that's a little dot there on the full frame, and punching in there to that 100% magnification, you can see that it's got all those fine details. You can also see that that is holding up right towards the corner. Really, really good when stopped down. Here's another landscape image, and once again you can see that there's just good detail and contrast. In this case, we can kind of look from edge to edge. Looks really good on the right side. If I pan across here over to the left side, it also looks good right off to the left side. Now, on a high-resolution body like the XH2, diffraction arrives quite early, so by f11 you're going to start to see softening effect. It's going to be less on the 26 megapixel or 24 megapixel sensors. You can see by f16, which is minimum aperture, the image is really starting to soften due to diffraction. Now, as mentioned previously, maximum magnification is 0.15 times, which is useful. It's not insanely useful, but it's definitely useful. And you can see that the detail and contrast is still holding up pretty well here up close. Contrast, again, isn't like intense, but the amount of detail being resolved is really quite good. And in good lighting conditions like here, you can see that the does a really quite a very nice job. There's lots of detail. Edges are nice and clean without any kind of bleeding off of them. And overall, the colors look good. The image, I think, in general looks good. Now, as noted previously, there is a little bit of uncorrected longitudinal chromatic aberration, but that often pays dividends when it comes to the softness of the defocus region. So in this case, if I kind of just pan around in the areas from focus to defocus, I don't really see a lot of fringing showing up here in the real world, but what I do see is that the background doesn't have a lot of outlining. Even though it's not far away, it looks fairly soft. In this image, I think the bokeh rendering is really quite beautiful, very kind of artistic and almost like a watercolor painting. Very, very nice. Here's a shot more indoors, more of a photography related subject. You can see again that just the more simple lines here are really nicely blurred out. I also found that overall color and contrast images looked good, and so here there's good levels of saturation without anything looking extreme. Here, more muted pastel colors at sunset. Image looks really great here as well. Another shot here, obviously it was a little bit of a moodier day as far as the weather, and so there's definitely some chop here on the bay, but you can see that in the general colors and the detail, I mean, look at all the detail up on here. It looks really, really impressively good. Now here is some dew and morning grass bokeh here, and so you can see it is able to get nice and creamy. Now here, in this case, I think that's artistic, and so composing in the right way, it works here. But as noted, this is a lens that does suffer from some flare-related issues. In this case, when I'm composing with the sun more at the mid-frame, you can see it's not too bad. I mean, there's some mild ghosting artifacts, not bad. But if it's up towards the corner, you start to get this very, I think, disruptive flare pattern, particularly when you're stopped down. This is f11 here. And so just something to be very careful for when you're composing. So there you have it. I hope the deep dive into the optics has helped you to make a more informed decision as to whether or not this is a lens that could work for you. As always, thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.